Hey, what's up guys? So in the last video, I did a streaming comparison between the Pocket Cinema 4K and the GH5. However, I also wanted to compare their recording capabilities because they're both so good and have so much to offer in that regard. So instead of shooting a super long, like 30-40 minute video, I decided to split things up into part 1 and part 2. So this video is part 2. We're gonna look at some footage from both cameras, compare them, and then also compare the specs and features when it comes to produced and edited video from these cameras to try and see if one is better than the other for you in your church. Now, if you missed part 1, I'll put a link right here so you can get to it. But otherwise, let's jump into part 2 of the comparison video between the Panasonic GH5 and the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. So let's start with the Pocket Cinema 4K. Now, the biggest difference we haven't talked about between these cameras is the codecs, what they can actually receive and shoot to as a media file type. I don't want to go too deep into codecs right now because that can get really confusing, but essentially think of codecs as a file type. With that being said, let's talk about the different codecs in the Pocket Cinema 4K, which is probably the biggest benefit of this camera lineup. The cinema camera piece is really why this whole lineup is named that. It's because cinema cameras shoot in what are called intermediate codecs. They're made for editing. They have way more data in them so that you can edit them a lot more aggressively without them breaking down and looking low quality. So the first kind of codec is Blackmagic RAW. So RAW video, really quickly, is the least compressed type of video file there is. They can be gigantic files that take a lot of work in editing to work with and make what you want to do, but they also have the greatest flexibility. There's so much data in there. You can shoot a completely wrong white balance at the completely wrong ISO and shutter speed, and it looks terrible underexposed or overexposed, and you can go in and completely fix it almost as if you're fixing it on set. So that's a huge advantage of using RAW file types, and Blackmagic RAW is really, really easy to work with. So it gives you 12-bit color depth. It's extremely gradable, which means you can, again, move it and take it one way or the other artistically as far as you want. And it's also really efficient. Compared to ProRes 422 HQ, almost every flavor of Blackmagic RAW is that size or smaller, which for RAW video is really, really great. But the problem is this is owned by Blackmagic and it doesn't work with Final Cut Pro 10. It does work with Premiere and it does obviously work with DaVinci Resolve, which is what it was designed for. You can do a little bit of transcoding to make it kind of fit your workflow. But if you're an Apple editor like me and you work on Macs and use Final Cut Pro, you're gonna have to transcode your Blackmagic RAW in a different software just to allow it to even be imported into Final Cut, which is a bit of a pain. All right, the other codec is the Apple codec, ProRes 422. There's 3 flavors of that, HQ, regular, and LT. But essentially this is a non-RAW but still very gradable codec. So it's more compressed a little bit, but it's still a really high data rate. It integrates with every editing software out there, and it does shoot at a 10-bit color depth at 422 subsampling, which if that means nothing to you, I don't mean to confuse you. It basically just means it gives you a lot of color information. So again, you can move it however you want without it breaking down and falling apart. Now, when it comes to the GH5, we are stuck with more of what's called a delivery codec. So these are AVC flavors. AVC long GOP is just what's called a delivery style codec. It's highly compressed, it's very portable, very small file sizes, and it is still very editable. As far as giving you room to color correct and grade, there's a lot going on there that you can still work with, especially if you go shooting in 422 10-bit or log. It is tougher to work with on your computer because it's more compressed. The computer has to do more math anytime you adjust pixel values and colors and highlights and shadows and all that. So that slows your computer down. Sometimes you need to make proxy files in order to make it more manageable for editing. So that can slow you down on the back end. But again, the perk is you can shoot on SD cards that are cheap. You can shoot all day and almost never run out of room. So that's the advantage of the GH5's codec setup. All right, here we are inside Final Cut Pro. So last Christmas, I helped a church in my area with their online Christmas service, which meant we shot essentially like 6 music videos ahead of time and the sermon and kind of did it all as one long uploaded video. So They have a couple of Pocket 4Ks, and then I brought my GH5 as a third camera, and we kind of shot them all, every song twice to get 6 angles to work with later, that kind of stuff. I actually made a YouTube video about that if you're interested in how to make those multicam, like music video type videos, like sync super fast. So check that out if that's a project that you're interested in doing or are struggling with right now. But essentially what happened is I got very similar footage from the Pocket 4K and from the GH5. So what we're going to do here today is basically compare. So these aren't the exact same shot because this wasn't done for the purposes of testing. This is just happens to be what I've got, and it's pretty much, a little bit more zoomed out, but same person, same song. So should be very similar to be able to compare and contrast the two. So this clip on the left is going to be from Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 4K. And if you want to see the information, all you got to do, now we shot in HD just for the pure sake of data rate and overall size, but it says codecs right here. If you go to the info tab, it says Apple ProRes 422HQ. It also says it right here, available media representations. So that's what it was natively shot to, and we used an SSD for that. If we go to the GH5, you'll see that it says AVC1, and same down here, AVC. Coding is got a lot of different varieties. The long GOP variety is what's used on the GH5, which is what you'll see on the actual camera's display. I'm going to try and reveal a little bit of difference between these two. So let's get to that. What I've done is basically, if I hit Command 7 here in Final Cut, I'm going to pull up a couple of graphs. I like this vector scope here. Basically, it's a pie chart of like a circle of colors. So every time there's something bleeding towards blue, purple, red, it says, hey, we've got a certain amount of saturation of that color. So that's what happens here. So if I increase saturation, you'll see these lines extend farther from the middle. And then it also tells you where those lines are. This is the flesh tone line. If you're not familiar with that, then check it out. It's really cool. No matter what nationality somebody is, their skin will be on this line. So it helps you see if you're off with your white balance, etc. This is what I kind of a Luma graph. I like this one because it shows me 0 is pure black, 100 is pure white. And it kind of shows me where we are as far as highlights and shadows go. So this is kind of a saturation and white balance, and this is kind of a contrast and exposure shortcut for me. So as you can see, this is pretty flat. It's not got a lot of life in it here, especially compared to the GH5, which comes out a lot. Now GH5, this is the natural setting, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But here, it starts out super flat, and that's how it's supposed to be. The more flat generally your codec is and your footage is coming out, it means that it's done less to the footage when it gets compressed, and it gives you more discretion about what direction you want it to go later. So if it came out super contrasty and super saturated, and I said, I don't like that look, I want to tweak it, or the white balance is off, you're going to have a really hard time doing that without it looking terrible. Try it on your phone and you'll see what I'm talking about. But this is super flat. So what I've done, and I'm going to spare you the details, is I've just whipped up a quick color wheel here. And so what I did is essentially drop the shadows and boosted the highlights to create a fair amount of contrast here, and it's not necessarily perfect, but something to just give it more life. And then saturation, you'll notice here, if I bring that back, this is, again, flat, coming straight out, nothing else is saturated, and I've got a ton of room. I mean, it doesn't start to look like, overdone until you're way up on the scale. Obviously, 100% looks ridiculous, but, if we go really up this far, it still looks lifelike. It doesn't look cartoonish, it's not overdone. And then I did move the temperature a little bit, so I work with this quite a bit. If you go back to normal here, you'll see it's a little too orange for me, and not a big fan of that, and it's kind of tinty. So I'm going to pull it in a little bit more blue, not a ton, and then I am going to actually add a little green to offset that magenta that tends to set in. So that's kind of what our final image looks like. So if I get rid of that graph and we zoom in here at 100%, which is really tight, this is an HD clip, this is a 4K clip and a 4K timeline, so I'm actually going to go 50% on this so we can compare them fairly. you know, it looks smooth and even basically, and she's moving in that shot right there. So let's get something without any motion blur, but you can tell, you know, there is a little bit of patterning going on with this sweater. You know, if you really zoom in there, it's struggling with the texture and kind of adding some chromatic aberration. But overall, I mean, everything is super smooth. Skin tones are not splotchy. Even with all the saturation added, it's not breaking down at all. We have nice roll off in these colors and shadow to highlight. It's not super blocky. ProRes 422HQ is a 10-bit codec, so it has a lot more color information in it. And overall, it looks very natural. So definitely happy with that footage. The last thing I want to do is just throw this LUT on. This is LUT. It used to be called White and Reverie as a company. Now they go by Gamut, and they sell all sorts of LUTs, mainly for wedding films, but I think it works for all sorts of stuff. So it's not at full strength, but again, it's not breaking down. It looks super clean and natural. And you know, if you came to this image immediately, you wouldn't be like, oh wow, look how graded that is. You'd just say, oh, that's a nice looking shot. So what I want to show is that yes, these cameras have the same sensor, size, and style, same amount of dynamic range, but the codecs they write to are gonna take color information a lot different. Now, I'm not shooting 10-bit, and I'm not shooting in log, and I've done a video on why, which you can check out here. But essentially, if you're shooting in an H.264 codec and you want to shoot in 10-bit log, you have to shoot at the 400 megabit per second all-I codec in the GH5. Otherwise, you're over compressing it and it's going to break down, and it's not actually going to be better, but it is going to be harder to work with. So that, in short, is why I didn't shoot that way. I shoot natural 8-bit here, which comes out looking fine. But if I copy and paste what I did to this ProRes footage onto here, I want you to see that the color wheels with that saturation is way too much. And then if I throw the LUT on there, the same LUT, I think I changed this, so let's just make it the same. That looks terrible. I mean, it really looks bad. So if we look at this color wheel, it looks, I mean, it's exactly the same as the one that I used on the other clip. You can see the saturation. Obviously, there's just not that much room for it. And that's kind of the point I want to make about these two types of codecs and shooting, is that you're just not going to get as much room in a delivery style codec as you're going to get in an intermediate codec. So it's not that it can't be worked with. This is what it looks like after I work with it to kind of match the two. They do still, you know, obviously the backgrounds are different. There's no green in this shot, but skin tone wise, I think they're very similar. There is still some differences. This might be still a little too saturated, but you can see how little I've added here, right? If we zoom in real fast, just take a look. Let's give this 100% so that it's equivalent pixel density, because this is a 4K file clip here, so we want it to be the same amount of data in the frame. Again, you can still see a little bit of chromatic aberration in this. Overall, it's just a little bit noisier to me. It looks a little bit softer overall. It's not quite as sharp in the areas that are in focus, which honestly surprised me a little bit. Overall, it doesn't look quite as clean to me. You know, it's not that it's totally broken down or anything like that, but it doesn't look nearly the quality that we're getting over here. If I go inside, you know, 50%, again, same pixel density here, this just looks a lot cleaner to me. And it's, again, it is a little bit closer in of a shot. So I'm not zooming quite as much to get these details in the hair and face and what's in focus, but I think there's a noticeable difference in the sharpness, but not just the sharpness, because you can over sharpen an image and it actually looks worse, but just in the clarity and in the level of pristine detail and just lack of any kind of you know, chromatic aberration or vignetting or moire or any of those other artifacts that you get with a lower end kind of delivery style codec. So hopefully this has helped you kind of see the difference. Again, if we talk about file size, you have to remember a 4K file over here in ProRes 422HQ especially is going to be about 4 times the size of a long GOP file. It might be down to about 2.5 times as big if you're shooting regular ProRes 422. But you have to consider that in your workflow if you want to deal with all that information all the time, filling up your hard drives. And it may not be worth it to you, but I want you to see the difference. Hopefully this has been informational. Now let's jump back into the rest of the video and compare overall features and see if we come to a conclusion about which camera would be better for you in your church. All right, now that we ran through that, let's jump in and compare these two cameras for video production. So when it comes to codecs, we've talked about what they mean a little bit, and I'm gonna give the edge for sure to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema because Blackmagic Raw and ProRes are both vastly superior for editing purposes. Now, when it comes to media types, there's honestly advantages for both. SD cards are cheaper, they're more secure, they're easier to use, they're not gonna fall out or become disconnected in the middle of filming, but they aren't really able to write at the data rates you need to use these nice codecs like an SSD or CFast card is. So I'm actually gonna award both of these because depending on what kind of shooting you're doing, this can be an advantage one way or the other. Now, something critically important between these two cameras is the stabilizer. So we haven't talked about this at all, but the GH5 has a built-in 5-axis stabilizer and the Pocket Cinema doesn't. So if you're shooting handheld at all, the Pocket Cinema is not gonna help you out. If you have a lens with IS built in, you'll get a little bit of shake reduction, but if you don't, every single tremor and heartbeat and whatever is gonna translate into that image, and it's just not gonna look very clean unless you're on a tripod or monopod. Whereas the GH5, you can shoot handheld all the time. If you have some semblance of camera control and like kind of body bracing, you can shoot, and almost looks like you're on a gimbal depending on your talent level and the type of shot you're doing. But 5-axis stabilizer for run and gun type shooting or vlog style shooting, massive advantage for the GH5. So I'm gonna give it that in that category. Now, again, we've talked about the viewfinder. When it comes to shooting, same stuff exists. If you're shooting on a gimbal or you're shooting off to the side, or you need to see two cameras and you're in between both, having an articulating viewfinder is more helpful. But having a bigger viewfinder, if you're doing sit-down work, is easier to do. I sometimes run into trouble with the GH5 on the tiny viewfinder. If I'm not right up on it, I can miss focus really easily, or I can miss a detail in the corner because it's kind of small. So both get the award there. And then again, autofocus, we've talked about this. I don't think it's that big of a deal, so neither of them are going to get the check there. So to wrap this up, when it comes to produced video, the question, which one's better? The answer is it depends on what you're shooting. Now, if you're gonna shoot any type of run and gun content or vlog content or event type video content, I would say the GH5 has an advantage. It is a lot easier to use handheld because of the stabilizer. It doesn't require any accessories. You put an SSD right on your camera and then carry it around outside and move it, and that thing's probably gonna pop out in 3 seconds, right? So you gotta have a little bit more going on to run with the Pocket Cinema in that scenario. So the GH5 to me is superior when it comes to just everyday workflow. Now, if you're shooting a lot of tripod studio type stuff, where you're using tripods, you have the lighting set up, you're not moving the cameras, and you wanna have that really high quality look, Pocket Cinema is better. Now, you're gonna have a lot more footage to work with. Those codecs are 3 to 4 times as big as what you get on the GH5. So prepare to buy a lot of hard drives, prepare to be archiving footage a lot more, but you are getting a lot more for it. So again, it depends on what you're using it for and what your capabilities are as a church. But to me, between streaming and produced video, I think there are a lot of advantages to using the Pocket Cinema 4K. As much as I love GH5s, as much as I'll continue to use them for what I do, for you, I think it's probably going to overlap a lot between streaming and produced video to go with the Pocket Cinema 4K. But hopefully this video has given you the tools and the content to actually make that decision and helped you find some clarity on deciding which camera is best for you. Again, if you want more info on gear for churches, specifically for streaming and produced video, check out the free church video gear guide in the description below. There's also links to our courses and other resources to help you reach more people through video. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.